Welcome everyone to our weekly Zoom meetings. And today we have world-renowned astrologer and author Erin Sullivan with us. And she will be presenting archetypal psychological astrology in contemporary practice. This is the third class, module 3. And, excuse me, and her book, Retrograde, so sorry everyone, her book, Retrograde Planets, Traversing the Inner Landscape, is one of her books. She's got many. She's a wonderful astrologer, good to look her up, and we're very happy to have you, Erin. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, so if you can hear me all right, this is really great. It's been an improvement in technology, so I don't have to use earphones anymore. Now, yeah, this the talk that I'm going to give today is a kind of shortened of module 3 in class 3 of my full course, and I always like to make it really clear that I'm doing this out of love and pro bono for evolutionary astrology, and it's just, to me, something that I do. It's what we want to do. We want to have that. However, to get on with it so we can get our hour in without losing any time, when the sounding of Uranus occurred and we went outside the boundaries of Saturn, I mean, since the Chaldeans and 3,000 years ago in earliest star, trackers, there was never a planet beyond Saturn, nor was there ever suspected to be one. And so the sighting of Uranus was actually quite fascinating and very, very surprising, to astronomers. And I think in part because it coincided with a tremendous number of global psychological, practical, physical changes that took place in our way of our viewing the world. And I love this picture. I interjected all of these, but it was such a very tidy setup in the beginning, up until the sighting of Uranus, where we had Aries and Taurus, etc., as you know, and Mars and Venus in perfect opposition, and Venus and Mars in perfect opposition, and Mercury and Jupiter, and then, the Moon and Saturn. These are all polarities, as you know, you're good enough in astrology. The Sun and Saturn. So what we ended up with, and Mercury and Jupiter, is we ended up with, a really perfect balance between the Moon and the Sun, Mercury and Mercury, Venus and Venus, Mars and Mars, Jupiter and Jupiter, Saturn and Saturn. When Uranus was sighted, it kind of blew apart our really ancient way of viewing the horoscope. And then, of course, came Neptune, which also had its influence in having to assume some role in astrology. And it was, in some way, Neptune usurped Jupiter into Pisces. And when we finally, in 1930, yet again saw another planet, Pluto, and there was a great argument. When I show you the sighting planet or chart, you'll see what I mean. But there was a bit of an argument, if you will, between Mars, who's not really fond of being usurped in any way, shape, or form, by this interloper from way out distant. And it was 1930. So in fact, it's in our lifetimes, really, a lot of us, it's in our lifetimes, not immediate lifetime, but just a matter of, decades before we were, all of us were born. And so that's the, sort of the picture to keep in mind is that the outer planets essentially came in as interlopers and took rulership over signs which are sub-ruled, because one still considers the Saturnian side of Aquarius and the Piscean side of Jupiter and the Marsian side of Pluto, because Uranus does have to do with collectives and groups and organizations and relationships with people, in many cultures. But in the old world, Saturn did as well. It ruled the boundaries and the limits of our relationships with collectives and groups. And Neptune coming in to usurp Jupiter for the ruler of Pisces, thereby leaving him as the second ruler, the secondary ruler. It talked about a new level of consciousness that came in the form of spiritualism and spirituality. It grew from, very hardcore sort of tribal belief systems, which is Jupiter, into a more ethereal, if you will, unknown, mystical, almost shamanistic kind of rulership over Pisces, or the collective unconscious in the Jungian sense of the word. That Jupiter was the collective consciousness of a tribe, because they were all little tribes. And now we have a global collective unconscious. And Pluto being sighted in 1930, well, when we get there, we'll talk a bit more about that. But this picture I like it because I created it so that it would make it clear what it means to have the outer planets and where they're situated. And with Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, there used to be, when Roger, who was actually my first hands-on instructor or teacher, his book, Lunation Cycles was the first book I ever read. And I found, I'd read other astrological material, but he really struck me as being, a kind of whole man, like a really, Renaissance man, which he was. And it's been said that the outer planets are transpersonal. I think that's kind of out of fashion now. I'm glad, because they're not transpersonal. In fact, they may be more personal than the sun and the moon, in the sense that there's only one way that you and I and everyone in the world will experience a transit of Uranus. Nobody gets the same events or psychological awakening. Same with Neptune. When Neptune is going over someone's sun, for example, they aren't all going to go through exactly the same process. Very often, though, when Mars, for instance, transits, we do have a list of things that can happen, from cutting your finger to, having a fender bender in your car. When we get to Pluto, that is possibly the most important personal planet when it comes to our own growth. And since we've, as I say here, but still we hardly know you friends, that's because it's only been one cycle of Neptune that we've actually been through. It's been, around once. It returned to 25 degrees of Aquarius a couple of years ago, which is where it was when it was sighted. Uranus, we've had 4 returns of Uranus, since it was sighted. And with Pluto, we've only had 88 years of Pluto transits. So we don't really have a full, we can only look back, like Tarnas wrote in his book, Cosmos and Psyche. He, or as a researcher, went back to all the dates where these planets have been in interaction with each other and were essentially charged the collective unconscious, thus emerging into the collective consciousness, entirely new ways of existing. So, we can make some pretty good assessments, I think. We're pretty, but we have to be very careful not to invent or to, I just see so much bad astrology, and I'm not being rude, okay? This is just what it is, because that's what we're all talking about now, is the, accessibility to astrology via, say, the worldwide net, www, the whole world. And as a result, people often just sort of copy other people, or they, write something that they dreamed up, or however, it really takes a lot of real research and real looking. And when I was writing Retrograde Planets, it was like I was living in another kind of world. I was living in London, and I had, some of the finest colleagues that I could hang out with. It was wonderful. And so I would sort of plague them mercilessly with, well, what happened when when your personal Uranus went direct, because it was retrograde when you were born. So I got a lot of people telling me some stuff after I told them what I suspected that it might have meant. And one very well-known astrologer, when Uranus went direct in her horoscope, was when she began to first publish reports. I mean, through the internet. I mean, not through the internet, through computer programming. And so, Uranus can mean innovative new ways of thinking. Neptune can be a greater sense of one's own psyche, the depths of the soul. And then Pluto also reaches the deepest, most dark, and I don't mean dark like as in negative, but just simply not visible. So these planets, because they aren't seen, and this is what I love about them, is that just because you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there, right? And so I put up the discovery charts of the planets first, just to make a quick run through. And you're going to notice something really interesting, which is why I highlighted. Every single discovery chart has the moon in Scorpio. Yeah, it's also conjunct the nodes. And so there's something about Scorpio and discovery and looking beneath the surface and seeing the invisible. That's how I perceive it. And so the truth, real truth, lies in the nature of things. Because the word physics, for instance, we have physicists and physics, and it actually means nature in Greek. And nomos, the opposite, is culture. So we have a nature and we have a culture. So we have physics and nomos. And the truth lies in the nature of things. And when you look at these charts and their hard aspects, every single one of them involves outer planets, even if they weren't visible. Outer planets always involved. I can't see this, the chart here of discovery of Neptune because of the sidebar, but I know that there's a Neptune-Saturn conjunction. When Saturn or Neptune was sighted, it was almost as if it took Saturn to contain Neptune so we could see it. But we have a Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and in the discovery of Uranus, we have a Uranus-Neptune relationship, and in the discovery of Pluto, we have Saturn opposite Pluto squared by Uranus. So there's some kind of cosmic conspiracy here going on where we were able to visualize, to actually see, and only after the discovery of Uranus, which involved using a telescope, which was an invention. And the discovery of Neptune was really interesting because Galileo actually saw it 3 times. That's why I'm putting this time. Is December 28, 1612, Galileo saw Neptune through his telescope. But it was conjunct Jupiter exactly. And so he thought it was a fixed star. And then again, a few weeks later, or a month later, he saw it again. Now, when he first saw it, Neptune and Jupiter were retrograde, but in the same degree. Okay. The second time he saw it, Jupiter had gone direct, but it was still with Neptune. And so it eluded him. So it wasn't until 233 years later and new telescopy that we actually saw Neptune, and it was actually with Saturn conjunct. So I always think that, Saturn in alchemy rules lead, plumbum. It's the part of the sort of dross, the work of the alchemist. And Neptune does have to do with alchemy and to the alchemical process, which involves the instinctive nature and our deep psyche. And so these outer planets, awoke a sleeping archetype, as I write here, in the collective unconscious and in the collective consciousness. And because it's a short talk, I'm not going to list them all, but when we have the global transits of these outer planets, and we look at them, transiting the world, you'll notice there's our events, things go on. And when they're transiting an individual's horoscope, each invoke a new stage of consciousness over a lifetime to individuals. Oops, I almost ended the show. Let's see what I have next. Oh, okay, this is to show you. My introduction to retrogrades was really interesting because in 1967, I was at the Theosophical Institute in Los Angeles, and I was listening to a lecture by the absolutely amazing Manly Palmer Hall. And I was holding my little 1947 paper Rosicrucian ephemeris, and I was looking at R under my Mercury at this, this little R. And I was like dying to know what this was. And so at question time, I said, put up my hand and I said, sir, what does the little R in the ephemeris mean? This was 1967. I mean, this was a long time ago. And he says, it indicates that planet's gone retrograde, but it doesn't mean anything. And I thought, oh, okay, I'm a Scorpio, Mercury and Scorpio retrograde, square Mars, Saturn, and Pluto. It does mean something, and I'm going to find out what it is. Now, I didn't find out in 67, but when I wrote my book in 2001, I came across some interesting stuff. And now this is right out of Rujar and Dane Rujar's book. When you say that a retrograde planet doesn't mean anything, when it's retrograde, most, a third to a quarter of the time, to almost a half in the case of Pluto, it has to mean something. It has to mean something other than direct. So to me, that diagram in Rujar and Riel's book was, kind of like the ceiling of my understanding that there really is something important about it. And then when I went on to do my own work in it, I discovered something really remarkable, and that is, all planets that go retrograde from sort of Jupiter outward, and Mars included, but differently, because Mars is a maverick. Mars he does not obey the rules. He is incredibly different in its retrograde cycle. However, when we look at any planet from Jupiter outward, it's retrograde for about 4 months. And in the course of the outer planet going retrograde, it actually passes over the same degree. Let's say you have Neptune at 13 Pisces. Neptune will pass over that degree 3 times in an 18-month period, which is basically 2 human gestation cycles. So there was something in there that struck me as being sort of birth orientated, that there was a certain level of gestation, 8.5 months, which is a viable fetus if it was a baby. And it happens 3 times. So people get really kind of freaked out because, they're going to have Uranus go over their, sun or Mars. Let's make it scary. 3 times, in 18 months. Like, am I ever going to get over this? Well, yes, but in phases. So we get over everything. I mean, don't we? All of us are sitting here thinking, right, I have survived this and I've survived that and I got over it, or I went through it and I became something better. And I think that's what the big message is with these outer planets, is that their passage over these natal planets 3 times, because in this one I used the moon as an example, because when I was writing the book, the moon, Pluto was like sorry, I can't remember. That's okay. We're in the middle. Half my family lives in Pahoa in Hawaii, and they're, running from lava and trying to get their stuff out of their houses while they're in evacuation mode. So I'm a little jumpy today. But these three passes of the outer planets are evolutionary, so that we evolve through them in extremely important ways to be, more and more increasingly of ourselves, because you don't turn into somebody else, it's you. So if something happens, you can't say, well, it isn't happening to me, because it is happening. It is you. So these are actually awakenings into new levels of yourself that are invaluable. And of course, now that we're really pretty conscious, not everyone, naturally, the world the way it is, it's not true. But those of us who pay attention to these types of oddities, we are more conscious. And when you are aware that you are having these transits this way, you embody them in a much better way, much more healthy, much more conscious. But the first hit, and somebody once said you shouldn't call it a hit, and I'm saying, well, I'm afraid it is. It is a bit of a hit. The first time that I plan it, and it can either go like this, okay, where it goes up to the degree, in this case 1 degree of Capricorn to the moon, and stations, goes retrograde, direct, crosses back over it and passes it on the second pass. And the third pass is predicted that it will go stationary direct at the same degree as it went retrograde within a few minutes. Okay. The second paradigm is where it will go over the said 2 degrees of Capricorn in this case, and then it will turn retrograde, maybe 4 or 5 degrees. And then it will go back over that moon, that degree of 2 degrees, and then it will go direct pass over it. So it's kind of a passage as opposed to a flashpoint. And I'll talk about flashpoints in a minute. So the first pass can actually be preceded by a lot of, I write here, subterranean rumbling in the psyche. There's something happening. You start to really make conscious, without being conscious of it, of course, that you're on a path that is about to have a radical evolutionary change. The second pass is when you have opportunity to reflect on what's been going on. And that's why I called this particular talk on the outer planets retrograde, repose and reflection, because you're able to actually see from events and personal interior experience what has happened under this passage. And you can describe this to clients, in this way, and they'll actually be amazed. Not that we're in the business of amazing people, although we are in the business, at least I am, of helping people become increasingly more conscious of what's going on and who they really are and what it's all about. And the third pass, let's say here where it goes bang, stop, direct. And, when you look in the ephemeris, because that's the most important book that you'll ever have, and you can have all the books by all the best authors, but the most important one is your ephemeris, and you need to read it all the time, especially during these periods. And when you look at the retrograde cycles, you notice it takes about our planets. It takes almost like 14 days in the ephemeris for it to actually come to a complete halt and then start to grind forward or backward. And so that, does mean that if in somebody's progressed horoscope, Uranus stations direct, for example, it's actually been stock still for like 7 days before your birth and 7 days afterwards, 7 to 10. And so I can't really say that they will bring an event, but they often do. And those events are based upon something that the inner self is deeply desirous of, even though the outer self is resisting it. That's kind of normal. Like say something has happened, like with my family over in in immediate family, I mean blood family. In Hawaii, I'll tell you that my ex-husband, who's a very good friend, and our kids are like in 50 and 49, grandchildren in their 20s and so on. They live in Pahoa, and the lava is encroaching upon their house. And she texted me in the middle of, while this is going on, the very beginning of the major Hawaiian eruption of Kilauea in Pahoa, and the earthquakes, which do not promise to stop. She says, can you look at what was going on, what the transits are? And they were evacuated at 2:30 in the morning. And so I looked at this and I thought, oh my God, I really don't want to look at this. It's like too scary. And then I was there for about another an hour watching my show on TV. And I thought, and I suddenly I just had to get up and look. So I set the chart, a horoscope for 2:30 in the morning on May the 3rd, I think it was, of their evacuation set in Pahoa. And I couldn't believe it. It was so brilliant. Oh, I mean, astrology was brilliant. The situation is pretty bad. Her sun is 13 degrees of Pisces. Neptune, ruler of earthquakes, because he strikes the ground with his trident to crack the earth, and then the resultant tsunami from an earthquake, which is not going to happen in Hawaii. The geophysicists have determined that. But he is the god of the ocean, Poseidon, right at 13 degrees of Pisces, right on her sun. So then I look at her husband, my kid's dad, and he's a Capricorn. He's rather typical Capricorn type, as all my Capricorn members of my family are. And the moon and Saturn at 2:30 in the morning of their evacuation was conjunct at 8 degrees of Capricorn, right on his natal sun. And I just typed this out to her because she knows astrology very, very well. And there was no time for interpreting it. Didn't need to. I said, this is what was happening when you were evacuated. And she just went, oh, that is amazing. And so they're in the awareness reflection period of what's going on, because Saturn is backward and Neptune is forward, but it will move away. But I thought that was a pretty astounding example. And the way this works is it's really the sun that's causing retrograde. It's not the planet doesn't screech to a halt, move backward, and move forward. But it's as the orbits of the outer planets go round, and the sun once a year, every year, as soon as the sun gets to within a trine, here's the outer planet, okay, and this is the sun going round the circle, makes a square, a separating square, and then it begins to form a trine. The minute it begins to become within orb of the trine, and it's all listed here, and it's in the book, how many days exactly, that outer planet that we're talking about does station retrograde in trine. So any planet that is within this zone, in other words, in the triangle between the quincunx, the opposition, the quincunx, and the other trine, final trine to square, the planet is always retrograde. And so what we end up with is when the sun has made its aspects to the outer planet in question, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, it does work for Saturn, there's something called the flashpoint. And the flashpoint is when the outer planet is exactly opposite. The sun is exactly opposite to the natal planet. It's midway in the cycle. And that's when the most astounding moment in time occurs. It's a time of illumination about the long outer planetary transit of 18 months actually happens. And so that picture was to me a revelation. It's all a revelation. Okay, so here we are at Uranus, the badly behaved planet. It rotates on its side. Rotates. It is retrograde. It's moving away from the sun. I wish I could see that. There. I can't see it. Oops. Okay, so Uranus. Now, Uranus is a rebel, and it was the first planet that was seen outside the body of Saturn. And so when we have Uranus transit, and it does make its back and forth, because it will, when it's transiting your a natal planet, it's inevitable. It is predictable. It will happen. And what it's meant to do, I believe, if we can consider of psychic components in our sort of collective and individual consciousness, what it does is it shocks us into awakening to something and that we perhaps had never seen before, kind of like the sighting of Uranus. It's like the wake-up call. I sometimes call it the alarm clock of the zodiac because it's saying, wake up, wake up. And then when we get to Neptune, it's sort of like, oh God, just turn off the alarm. So let's just go back to sleep. Then we get to Pluto. We have to say, well, that didn't work. I guess I really do have to face up to consciousness. And so with the Uranus retrograde, what we're really seeing is in our personal lives, when it's going retrograde in your own chart, 3 times over the same degree. And it doesn't actually have to be with a planet because these cycles are they're solar system cycles. So it could be not making any aspect at all, which is a little unusual, but it still could be. But whenever it goes retrograde every single year, this is an opportunity, and it'll be in a house, so it'll be describing something to do with the quality of the experience that you have in that particular house, that there will be a slow 18-month procession of awakening to something entirely different, of being able to accept that the world as you once viewed it will never be the same again. And this is not negative. It just is what it is. I mean, we can't blame planets for anything. I even find myself, correcting when I say, well, because Mars did this. And I go, wait a minute, no, it's not because of Mars at all. It just happens to be a Marsy, Marsy zone that you are in, and this is what has taken place. But with Uranus, it'll crack open. Because it is a bit of a shocker. I mean, the sighting of Uranus was absolutely, utterly revolutionary. And it was not expected, although astronomers certainly knew there was more out there. But, the world absorbed it. The Royal Astronomical Society took it in. They realized, wow, we've really got something going on here. And it's like that for us. Like when we have Uranus making a transit back and forth 3 times, the same point in our chart. And again, as I say, don't just associate this with a planet, a natal planet, but associate it with an experience that you're having in the house in which it's doing that. And depending on the size of the house, if you're born in moderate latitudes, you usually have some reasonably, house sizes are basically pretty close to the same. If you're born on the equator, they are the same. The further north you go, or south, the relationship of houses alters dramatically, and that's an astronomical fact and a geographical fact. So it's the further north you go, the further south you go, the more distorted the picture. But you can just see how big is your 5th house. Is it bigger than the 6th and the 12th? Then you would be able to say, well, Uranus will be in my house for like 4 years, or else it'll be there for 10 years. And those are how many times it would be going retrograde and direct. And so there's a really important significance, especially if it's hitting a planet, to having to accept that you are in the middle of a major growth cycle, and that you may move in yourself to accept relationships or occupations or circumstances that you would never have dreamed earlier that you could accept. You may not even have known or envisioned it. So Uranus is about just breaking the status quo as it did because it was sighted. It broke the status quo and opened the door to a realm of mystery. And Uranus, as the Aquarius ruler or 11th house ruler, has to do with our relationships with the collective. And it can be small collectives, like a little group like we are today. You have a sense of relationship with people. And they don't have to be now next door or in your tribe. They can be across the world, but you've got relationships with people as a tribal entity. And this is where Uranus comes in very importantly, is to open our eyes to what our tribal relationships are about. Jupiter has to do with this as well, because he is the ruler of travelers and also tribalism. But this was pre-Uranian. And so, when we have, sort of repeated 3 times aspect of a conjunction or a square, I should think a conjunction would be extremely personal, and I think a square could mean that it's actually coming from somewhere where you cannot see. Like I'm sitting here straight forward, staring at you, and you are in a perfect opposition to me, in which case I can see absolutely clearly what's going on. And therefore, sometimes when the outer planet is opposing and doing its retrograde figure on the natal planet, that means you know exactly what's going on, but it is about other people doing something that don't cause you, but they create change in your life. A square is really different, because if you sit facing like I am, and you can't quite see what's going on this square, it's like in your periphery, it's irritating. It's like, oh my God, and you can't turn your head, but it is, you can kind of feel it itching. So it can come, this sort of idealistic transformation, positive change, awakening, revelation. It can come from very surprising sources. I mean, you may never even expected it. And that would be the square. If it's the opposition, as I said, it really is between you and someone else, like you and the collective, or you and a person, or you and your partner. If it's a conjunction, it's coming from within. If Uranus is going back and forth of a natal planet, boom, 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 then it really is about you. And so you have to take personal responsibility for whatever the change brings to you that's so vital for your growth and your consciousness. If we move on into Neptune, Poseidon, it's quite a guy. I mean, the thing about the outer planets is that in mythology, the ancient mythic stories, which I'm just crazy about because I'm a classicist, the myth of these characters, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, who were, of course, Uranus, the sky god, and Poseidon, the god of the sea, but also the god of earthquakes, known as the trident. He would strike the earth with his trident, thus causing an earthquake, which would then result in a tsunami. And as god of the ocean, he also, is been depicted as horses, the god of horses, or horses are his animal. Because the dashing waves on the shore have been portrayed many times in art as horses crashing. I'm sure you've all seen the image of that. But when you have a Neptune transit, almost anything can happen. We don't really know what is going on in the level of our dream state, like our waking state. We can sometimes get a decent grip on, but not in the deep, deep unconsciousness, which is what the depth of Poseidon and Pisces really reaches, is into the very depths of our being. And as the god of the sea, he also has to do with a collective memory, because very often we think in terms of the ocean as being Earth's Gaia's memory. And this is why, the devastation that's going on in the transaction now between, the elemental forces, human nature, and the actual planet itself, we're really having some pretty difficult problems with the ocean. And, things are dying and shape-shifting all the time. And so, Poseidon being in his own sign, at this time frame in Pisces, having just returned about 5 or 6 years ago to 25 Aquarius, can't quite remember, but I know that it went over the United States moon when it returned at 25 Aquarius. And that sort of set the United States off on a really wild and quite, really crazy, situation where it's sort of overflowing. In other words, it's like trying to take over everything. And so the transit of Neptune, we now have a full round, and we've seen, we know very precisely what kinds of events take place under that. Now, if you have Neptune transiting and back and forth 3 times a part of a planet in your horoscope, then you can expect yourself to be to see the unseen, to actually envision the invisible. It has to do with being very deeply in love with the beauty of that which is not tangible, which would include things like, for instance, images. Movies. Neptune rules movies because it's a projection onto a screen. It rules, things like wanting to get into a higher level of consciousness, and people will seek out many ways of doing that. From the most spiritual to the most denigrated. Because the drug epidemic that's going on at this stage actually began around the time of the sighting of Neptune. And which is why I have the charts of the sightings, because it actually discusses in the chart what the planet is going to do as far as become a ruler and what's it going to rule. And, it was in the discovery of Neptune that we ended up with, the isolation of cocaine from the coca leaf, the alkaloid. And it just began this whole relationship of human nature. Not to say that the old rituals of the hashish smoking Indians and the Chinese taking opium and so on, that goes back and back and back. But the fact is that we're in a global drug disaster at this stage, and Neptune has a lot to do with it. It went into Aquarius. It was sort of like became mass, and now it's in Pisces. The drug situation, and it's not just in the United States. They don't talk. There's too many bombs going off in different countries, and for them to be concerned about the drug situation. But it is redolent, and it wasn't until Neptune was sighted that drug addiction became something very real. It's very, very interesting. So that there's many ways to go outside the body and into the realm of the mysterious and the unknown. And that's not a particularly good way to do it. A glass of wine, whatever. Things like, a little bit, it's fine. Anything that sort of elevates you and, from the sort of direness of a situation, or just simply to relax or enjoy with friends, fine. But when it becomes, a dependency, where Neptune does relate, because many charts with who have sort of families who have been addicted or gone through difficulties that way usually they have a very strong Neptune in their chart. I mean, my mother was an alcoholic, and I have a Moon Neptune conjunction, and my father became one. I mean, after they divorced, I mean, it was just this living nightmare. My story is just so dramatic, as you might imagine, just based on my horoscope. But drug addiction runs in the family, so I've always been really aware of it, like really conscious of it. And neither of my kids are drug addicts, and none of my grandkids are. So I'm going, oh, thank God I broke the chain of command through my own Moon Neptune conjunction. So when Neptune is transiting, it can want you, in a sense. You may need some solace, in which case try and find it from a source that isn't going to be dangerous to yourself. And I love this because see the drawing, okay, that is not a drawing, that's actually Arabic. And it's saying, and this is all written, okay, in Arabic. I love the Arabic script. It says, what have I need for this? What have I need for that? I am dancing at the feet of my Lord. All is bliss, all is bliss. Okay, well, that's the ultimate Neptunian image, is to go into a state of meditative bliss. And so to rise above it all is not a bad thing, or to become at one with everything is also not a bad thing. And so Neptune transits may even precipitate for you a fascination with spirituality and what it means and how it works. And there it is, the picture of Neptune. I really like that. Seeing the invisible. Dogma is an opinion, and doxa is Greek for truth. So there's a difference between your opinion and what's real. Always be aware of that under any Neptune influences in your chart. That, you don't want to get too caught up in that which is unrealistic, okay? But you need to seek the divine in the most mundane. You don't have to go to church or to meditate in order to have this experience. You also need to see the mundane in the divine. And it's about seeking soul, disappearing, shape-shifting, re-emerging. We get to Pluto. Pluto remains the planet of mystery. I mean, we really didn't know Pluto until February 18, 1930. And this fellow here is Clyde Tombaugh, and he's the one who actually sighted Pluto. He was determined that it would be there. And he was right. And the planet, let me just go forward a second, see what I've got next. Oh, I want to point this out. Generationally, Pluto is now spending a greater deal of quantitative time in the sign of Capricorn. When it was in the Scorpio in the early 80s, 1982, under Scorpio, which is when they studied AIDS, discovered the AIDS virus. It was only 11 years in Scorpio, okay? And all I can say is thank you, God, for giving me, a short 10-year transit of Pluto over all my fixed planets. People who are born with Pluto and Leo, they have a midlife square. Pluto will square itself between the ages of 42 and 44. If you have Pluto in Virgo, it will square itself between 39 and 40. If you have Pluto in Libra, it's 40 to 41. And Pluto in Scorpio is 36 to 37 ages. Now that's all sort of coinciding with the Uranus opposition, where we have our midlife awakening, okay? Because when Uranus opposes itself in the natal chart, which Neptune won't do, maybe it does, no, and Pluto can, but what we're talking here about is the age brackets of people born. Does that say? I don't have my glasses. Oh, 1037 to 1956. Oh my God, that's a typo in my book. That's longer than 19 years. That's like 156 years. So anyway, I just first noticed that, and I wrote the book in 2001, and I see a typo, and there's nothing I can do about it. I guess you'll just have to kind of get used to the fact that that's a mistake. Anyway, so our midlife turning point is a Uranian experience. It's when Uranus opposes itself. And that also, because Uranus does have a wobble, it's a little eccentric, but it's generally between the ages of 37 with Uranus and Gemini. And then with Uranus in like Libra and Scorpio, it's like around almost 40, 42. So both Pluto and Uranus have a big role in the midlife crossover, in the midlife transition. And the midlife transition is when we experience possibly one of the most radical changes, aside from the ages of 0 to 2.5 to 3. The most radical changes in our makeup, including our bodies and our chemistry and our brain and so on. And I mean, Pluto is just simply absolutely and utterly rebellious. He has no regard for convention at all. I mean, just look at its orbit. And we did a talk on the Pluto and the US charts about a year ago. Well, it was during the election period. And that's where I use this diagram to demonstrate the absolute irascibility and complete nonconformity of the planet Pluto. It will not behave. So don't expect it to. But just consider yourself, in a sense, quote, lucky, because you're living in a time when Pluto is, only going to go over the same planet in your natal chart by transit 5 times, over a period of a couple of years. It's now moved out of the same zone in my diagrams that I showed you earlier, into its own zone, where it's now moving into an elongation against the backdrop of the ecliptic, so that by the time Pluto gets to Taurus, it will spend 32 years in Taurus. So we might want to look back 250 some years to see what was going on during the last, when Pluto was in Taurus. But it'll be, the year 2227 before it will cross again to be within the orbit, or cross again to be, outside the orbit of Neptune. But right now, it's actually being a bit of a problem because of its Pluto, because of its lengthy transits. And it's becoming more difficult for me as a really seasoned and very full practicing consulting astrologer to be able to sort of predict, okay, like what's going to happen. I have a friend who has Mercury in her 4th house, and Pluto's going to go back and forth at about 6 or 7 times. That's by a square. And I'm going, I honestly don't know what this is. I just don't know, because I haven't seen it before. And so, we're entering a time of mystery of what is Pluto going to mean. So people have to stop saying they know what it's going to mean, because they don't know what it's going to mean, because we're going to have to discover it. So we're actually collectively in a time of discovery of what Pluto's power in elongation along the ecliptic, which means it looks like it's going through longer periods of time than it did in 1982. So we really need to ponder deeply and carefully, because we didn't even know about its moons, until 78. And then, and so Pluto transits are going to be something that we look at and try and work with the deepest part of our psyche. My friend Jim Lewis, the astrocartography creator, he and I had a really great relationship. He was really funny. He had Pluto on his ascendant, a brilliant speaker, just absolutely astounding. And he was born with Pluto rising. And when he died of a brain tumor, he didn't die of AIDS, he died of a brain tumor. And the planet Pluto was actually rising when he died. And so I thought, well, this guy was really Plutonian, and he really was. As a young boy growing up in New York, he used to go into the underground and walk through the tunnels and replace the lights that were in there with black lights. Well, this is like a 15-year-old kid. So I mean, and when you're 15, you don't know these things. And so when he finally became, an astrologer, recognized it, and then developed astrocartography, he had done all that under a Pluto transit. And so he saw something in a way that was, John Doe and, oh dear, his other name, his name slips my mind, another fellow, had pioneered this way of looking at the world, and I almost think this is very Plutonian in itself, is that the natal horoscope is a picture of the planets seen from Earth looking up around the sky, okay? But astrocartography is being up in the heavens, looking down on the Earth in Mundo and seeing where the planetary lines lie. And Pluto has to do with being able to look down on the Earth, as well as up from the core of the depths of where he ruled the underworld, because he wasn't a bad guy. I mean, he just got the underworld, and, as the luck of the draw with his brothers. And he, but a transit of Pluto is probably the most evolutionary transit you can get.
5 minutes left.
Good.
Sorry to interrupt. Okay.
Yeah, he scared me. I thought, oh my God, there's a voice. I'm talking about Pluto down in the end of, out in the very furthest reaches. Suddenly this voice comes in and says, you've only got 5 minutes. I'm going, oh my God, I have 5 minutes left to live. Okay, thank you very much, Linda. So the New Horizons mission has opened up a door. Now, whether we actually believe in this or not doesn't matter. It works. So just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't work. And so when we got out to the very edge of the atmosphere of Pluto and into it, carrying, by the way, some of the ashes of Clyde Tombaugh, who discovered it, to be released in the atmosphere. And that mission explored the worlds at the very edge of our solar system. And it made the first reconnaissance to the distant-most planet. And as a result, culminating by July 14th, 2015, we are now going to experience Pluto in ways which we have never known before. I mean, before August the 6th of 1946, when the bomb was dropped. We don't need to speak about that, but it is part of that. And so what we're facing really is, in the long term, probably global tribalism. In other words, we will become one, which is a very nice idea. I have no idea. But I do know that when Pluto transits your natal planets, or your houses, going back and forth in its 3-time cycle, or 5-time now, that it will open the doors to the invisible and more depth, real depth in yourself. You will be forced, or you will acquiesce to exploring yourself in a way that has never been seen before. And I think that's, what I can say about Pluto, at least right now. And so that's the reaches of outer space. I mean, it is as deep within as it is without. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. Could you please stop the share at the top of the screen, the red section?
Oh, okay, more. Okay.
Okay, stop share.
How do I, let me see, it says invite.
It's the red section at the top.
Chat? No, it says more, and then there's invite, record, disable, hide video panel, audio options, video, leave meeting.
Oh, never mind. That's okay. All right. Well, would be good to get back to the attendee panel.
Well, how do I do this?
Do you see a red button?
There's a red square with the number 5 saying more.
Oh, what about at the bottom? Would it be at the bottom?
No, those are only pictures of people.
Nothing. All right, never mind. Well, thank you so much. That was incredible as usual. And maybe escape. Maybe just. Can you see it now? Stop share.
Stop share?
Yeah. Can you see stop share anywhere on the screen?
Oh, I didn't know. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh, I do. Oh, wait, it's hiding. It's hiding behind the stuff.
There it is. Okay, sorry about that.
Well, can you see now or what?
Well, we've got 18 people in attendance, and we will all want to thank you so much for an excellent meeting. Looking forward to seeing you next time, Erin. And would you
Thank you, Erin.
Erin Sullivan, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
So good.
Wonderful.
Mind in a big place. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'd be pleased to work with you.
Awesome.
Erin. It was great.
And thank you, Linda. And
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time, Erin.
all right, love. Bye, everyone.